Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and welcome to the show, regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser, who, as we come to the end of the session, I kind of expected that we'd have to do this show with you like on a galloping horse, and I'd have to run along behind you.
Well, instead of a galloping horse, and nice to see you today, Olga, instead I just canceled and or stood you up 2 days in a row. So I'm glad that I can be here, not on a galloping horse, and that we managed to find a time to sit down together.
Yes, yeah. Good to see you too. What I am getting press releases fast and furious from the State House these days.
That's so fun.
Mm-hmm.
I should send out more press releases, but I have
one more thing to do.
So I don't need to.
You don't need to.
We are doing some really cool stuff. I didn't write up a tidy list of all the things because there's going to be so many more things next week, and that's when I'll make my tidy list. But some things that feel really exciting this week is the child care bill came back from the Senate, unanimously out of the Senate, came over to the House. We concurred with their amendments, and it's off to the governor. So good.
Wow.
We and for rehash for folks who didn't catch that episode, however many months ago that was, really significant investments to basically set a minimum amount that families need to pay for childcare to move us towards a system in Vermont where no family would pay more than 10% of their income in childcare costs, to significantly increase the wages of childcare providers so that we can have good quality childcare providers and childcare providers can have a good quality of life. And also some cool stuff around student loan forgiveness for childcare provider training. So there's more details, but that's an exciting one. The Senate, a couple of weeks ago, the House passed a bill decriminalizing buprenorphine possession, which is an opioid replacement drug that sometimes is easier to access on the street than it might be in rehab for folks who either don't want to access formal rehab or can't access formal rehab. So that's a really great path to making sure people in our communities stay alive. And this is the Senate today.
This has been an ongoing conversation. Hasn't this been a bit of an uphill push to get this passed?
It's been a really uphill push. It's been quite a few years. I know we did a really deep dive on harm reduction strategies a couple times, but particularly about buprenorphine and opioid stuff more than once. The most recent conversation we had about this and a few other bills was with two folks from COSU, the Consortium on Substance Use in Vermont. But yeah, no, that's incredible. And the House debate on the issue was one of the most inspiring political moments I've ever been a part of. And people really talked about how they don't want anyone else to die. And they might have had a different perspective on this a few years ago. And like today, knowing what they know and like loving who they've loved, they just don't want anyone else to die. It was really incredible to see people be vulnerable and curious and admit that they'd been wrong and be able to change their minds. And it was amazing. There was a House bill on consent and redefining consent, sort of modernizing the definition of sexual consent. That was having a very rough road of it in the Senate and has now, I think, gotten out of the Senate committee and passed the Senate. That feels like a really good win. And is coming back to the House. Those are the big ones that jump out at me about things that have gone back and forth. The budget is in committee of conference right now, significant investments in housing, significant investments in broadband that we've talked about. A lot of investments in Vermonters' quality of life. And we'll talk about some of the tax implications of that in a little bit. And then in my own committee, we've been working on S13, which is the pupil weighting factors report, and we voted that out of committee unanimously. And so that's an implementation plan and study connected to correcting the pupil weights and really looking at the long-term impacts and successes of Act 60.
Right.
And so the Senate, it's in our House Appropriations Committee right now, but the Senate's already starting to look at the changes we made to see if they can concur. That feels great. There's a rental housing registry bill that also is in our committee right now that's doing some good work to make sure we actually know how much rental housing we have. Yes, Olga.
Long-term rentals, short-term rentals. Oh, well done.
Thank you. They're both in the same registry. And then there's some health and safety stuff for the long-term rentals, but both long-term and short-term rentals are in the same registry. We'll actually know in a year or two how many properties we have for rent in Vermont and what they're being used for, and what accessibility modifications they have on them, which is also exciting. So that's a really fun win. We are finished work today in House Ways and Means on a new cannabis sort of update bill. Now that we have the staff for the Cannabis Control Board was just appointed, really. The governor was very, very late in that process. And so everything's a little bit behind. So we had to push out some fees and fee timing on it. But there's also a very cool new system built into this bill about how to make sure folks who have been experienced harm because of previous cannabis restrictions will be able to sort of made whole. And so there's a special fund set up in order to help people invest and start businesses in the cannabis industry.
Okay,
that's really, really fun. So we did some work on that. Some listeners might be really excited that there's a bill that allows Tesla to set up repair facilities in Vermont because of this very complicated thing around automobile franchises. They weren't allowed to before. Now they'll be able to. Don't have a Tesla, so I
don't have a Tesla.
I'm too engaged on that one, but people seem really excited about it. And that's all I have for now for like brief fly-by-night updates. We've been doing about a bill every hour lately in Ways and Means, so it's everything feels a little shell-shocked.
So does it feel like, so we've been hearing, I
forgot one. This one's really, really exciting. Yesterday on the House floor, we voted out this bill that significantly expanded voting access. So we made the vote by mail work that we did sort of as a transition point with the pandemic. So we made the vote by mail permanent, and it would operate the same way it did during the pandemic. Mandatory, it is mailed out by the Secretary of State, but the voter is welcome to drop it off or bring it in or mail it back. We have these really cool drop boxes during all of our elections in Brattleboro, but that's actually fairly unusual. And so expanded drop boxes and some funding for the drop boxes all through the state. So that's very exciting because in a lot of places you need to like actually go find your clerk and hand it to them. And then a bunch of really great stuff around ballot curing so that if you make a mistake on your ballot, you have a chance to fix it. So if you like vote for too many people or you don't sign your name for things like that. Yeah, so a lot of states have, we have
Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah. I'm very hyper. You just need to jump right in.
Well, I'm glad you said that because when you when you pushed out over social media that this voting access had passed, I had two questions. And one was about ballot curing, because I wasn't sure if that was at the point of when the voter was voting or when they were counting, so determining whether something's a spoiled ballot. Does it work with spoiled ballots at all, or is it just for when the vote? It's
mostly about spoiled ballots, actually. It's
okay.
And so if your ballot is sort of collected and counted prior to like the final counting, your town clerk is actually, and your town clerk realizes it and knows it's your ballot because there's something wrong on the envelope or something like that. then your town clerk is actually required to be in touch with you to let you know that your ballot is spoiled.
Okay.
And then you can check your My Vermont Voter page to see if your sort of ballot has been mailed out, and then if it's been received, and like there's a few sort of stops along your ballot's line that you can check on your My Voter page. And so if someone notices on their My Voter page that they sent in their ballot, but it wasn't received, they now have a remedy to sort of fix that as well.
Neat. Thank you. Now, what about the voters checklist? That was the other thing I had questions about, because most voter checklists are right now handled town by town, but this sounded like, at least what you put out on social media, that there's going to be one voter checklist and it will be all managed by the Secretary of State.
Clerks will confer with the Secretary of State, but the Secretary of State will have a master voting list so that they can mail out those ballots.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And, you know, town clerks are a wily, awesome, committed bunch.
Yes, they are.
With very varied opinions about things.
I bet. And did you hear all of them?
I personally did not hear all of them. I mostly just talked to the incredible town clerk in Brattleboro, Hillary. But I think a lot of my colleagues heard from a lot of them, because a lot of my colleagues represent multiple towns with multiple town clerks. And there was a lot of deep collaboration with the town clerks to make sure we were doing something that both felt ethical for them and would not overburden their already fairly full work schedules. And so that was good. And it's always nice for me. My colleague Kelly Piala represents Londonderry, is a town clerk in Londonderry as well. And so it's always nice for me to really like get the nitty gritty with her about how things work when we're working on a bill like this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Now, will having this master voting list, we always hear this argument of, oh, voter fraud because people are voting twice and da. Will this be a check and balance to that? I mean, not that it really happens in
people
Vermont.
don't actually do that. So
Yeah.
I don't know. One of the things that keeps on coming up is this idea of ballot harvesting,
I have never
which is
heard of
a
that.
hypothetical form of voter fraud where people like gather imaginary people, which I always imagine with sacks like Santa, gather hundreds of blank ballots when they're mailed out from like from mailboxes, which is, a federal, you're not supposed to tamper with people's mail. So there's like a federal offense piece of that too. So you don't even have to worry about the voting fraud because this person's already committing a federal offense. And then they like forge a bunch of stuff and then collect it all and then drop it off all at once. I think that's what ballot harvesting is. And then the other theory on ballot harvesting is like sort of you coerce a bunch of people and then bring in all their ballots all at once. And so that came up a bunch of times.
Oh, wow.
But
That's a
I
new
think
one.
that ballot harvesting, and I've made this joke a few other times, is a lot like partial birth abortions in that they do not exist. They're just a thing that have become very vivid in the imagination of people who are concerned about either abortion or voter fraud. And they've taken on this life of their own, but neither thing actually exists in real life.
They're the things that go bump in the night.
Yes. So we talked about that on the floor a lot, and there are actually mechanisms in the bill in that someone can't drop off more than a certain number of ballots at once. And I'm not, as a person running, allowed to drop off anyone's ballot other than mine and my partner's or something like that. Yeah.
Because you have so much time on your hands to run around to people's houses and gather up ballots.
Yeah. I don't think anyone working on my campaign is allowed to do it either. But.
Because they also have so much time to do that. Yeah.
So that's the bill. I think we have a little bit of a delay between us today.
I think we do too. I don't know about you, but there's some pretty high winds where I am. So who knows?
I have no winds where I am. Interesting.
Our computers are probably just in shock from all the Zoom meetings.
Maybe. There's some really nice flowers growing out of the grass.
That's
spring
nice.
Ephemerals. I think I toasted to them last week, didn't I?
You did.
They really get me. I might need to toast to them again.
You would be welcome to.
So all those bills I mentioned are all in various stages. We sort of got a reminder from a listener that a little more process might be helpful for people.
Right.
So all the bills I mentioned this time around are all sort of actively being negotiated between the House and the Senate. And they're all likely to make it across the finish line, but some of them might be just sort of concurred with by the House or the Senate and then sent on to the governor. And some of them might move to a committee of conference. And what happens when a bill moves to a committee of conference is there's 3 members from the House and 3 members from the Senate. They are put in a imaginary room together. It's a real room when there's no pandemic, but right now it's an imaginary room, a Zoom room. And they're put in that room together and they need to iron out the differences between the 2 bills and come up with a new bill. And the new bill, which is called the report of the committee of conference, can only use material from the 2 versions of the bill. They're not allowed to throw new things into the mix.
Okay.
So if you think about sort of negotiation, it's interesting because often in a really good negotiation, you sort of find a third way. There's no third way available in a committee of conference because you're just working with material from the 2 versions. And then everyone has to sign on and agree to it. And then that then gets sort of voted on and concurred with in both bodies. And then it goes to the governor. And so that's what I meant when I said the budget was in a committee of conference.
Gotcha. And when you said when everyone has to sign on, you meant the 6 members who had been put in the imaginary room.
Yeah, and actually, I'm sorry, it's a majority of the House members and a majority of the Senate members. It doesn't have to be unanimous.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
So the family medical leave bill went to a committee of conference 2 years ago. And one of the conferees did not sign on to it. So it does happen.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So does it feel at this point like the legislature is going to make their May 22nd deadline?
That is still the rumor on the street. The fact that the budget's in conference is a really good sign. There's some concerns because we got new federal guidance over the weekend on how we can spend ARPA dollars. And so some reshuffling needs to happen, but that will happen and that seems okay. And then there's a lot of bills that are still in the mix, but they all seem fairly close to the finish line. And the ones that aren't close to the finish line have been moved very far away from the finish line so as not to distract people. And so, yeah, it still feels like we will be finished next Friday.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, it's a huge difference because if we remember this time last year, the pandemic was still, you were still shuffling all the pandemic issues. And when did the legislature officially adjourn last year? Wasn't it in the fall?
So the last year, the legislature usually adjourns right around this time. But and then doesn't start again until January 1st. You know that, I'll go telling other people who might.
We're letting the others know.
And then on last year, I think we went through to July.
Okay, that sounds,
and took August off and then came back for a month in October.
Okay.
We took like August and maybe some of September off and came back in October. And I think the Appropriations Committee was still meeting through those, and a few policy committees were still meeting through that gap time. The Ways and Means wasn't. Yeah.
It was a session that felt like it never ended.
It didn't ever end, which is, there, as I've said 100 times before, there's definitely a place for a professional legislature. But when you have a part-time legislature where people have jobs and have made promises to employers to be back full-time at a certain date, it's really hard to be flexible around that stuff. So I know my workplace, people were getting fairly frustrated and I was feeling fairly filled with guilt, and I was lucky to keep my job through the summer. But I know, I have a colleague who works at a sawmill and her boss needs someone to be milling the wood. It can't just build up,
Right.
And she can't cover it from home in between sort of the cracks of the day. So the longer we go on, the more members we actually just sort of lose because they need to go back to work. And so vote counts get lower and lower, and the chances of doing something controversial get lower and lower. So that's part of the reason that we try to stick to the deadline.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Well, I mean, one of the things we've talked about a lot is who can actually afford to serve and who can take time off work. And that's not everybody.
No, and who can afford health insurance if they're working part-time.
Right. So, excuse my ignorance on this one. I thought lawmakers received health insurance.
Oh, no.
Huh.
No.
That's interesting.
No, we do not receive health insurance. Yeah. Yeah. I love that.
I can't speak for all voters, but to me that seems kind of logical.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my colleagues are over 65, and so they're on Medicare. And so it's actually probably wouldn't even be that expensive to give us health insurance because not all that many of us would be eligible for it. And we could ideally join the state employees health insurance system. The other,
right? It's an existing program.
And that we would, that certainly the staff that work with us are part of. So yeah, that would be really cool.
Okay. Food for thought.
Yeah. Anyone else who wants to start a movement to get me health insurance, please do. It's really, it's very challenging politically to work on issues that would help bring more people into the political process because it looks self-serving from the outside.
Yeah.
So we generally don't ever change these things, even though they'd probably be in the best interest of Vermonters.
Right. Well, I mean, that is kind of a slippery slope when people are voting on their own salaries or they're voting on their own benefits. I mean, I can see how that's a slippery slope.
And the way we do structure it is we structure it for like 2 biennium from now, the change will happen so that it won't immediately impact any of the people who are voting on it, but it is still hard.
Yeah. We have just about 5 minutes before we go to break. And then I know we're going to talk about some of the tax things that your committee Ways and Means is working on. But in these last 5 minutes, anything else you think people should know about the end of the session or keep their eye on?
Another thing that's really interesting that I'm feeling really excited about, it hasn't been finalized yet, but I think we've come to some pretty decent agreement, is the unemployment insurance system, which was from my perspective, probably the greatest failure of state government that we've seen for decades.
That was a mess, yes.
And a lot of it absolutely not the fault of the unemployment insurance division. We had an ancient computer system that was not ready for the task. We did have an unemployment trust fund that was ready for the task, and we actually had one of the most solvent unemployment trust funds in the country. Some states bankrupted theirs and had to borrow money from the federal government.
Right.
But the way the trust fund is filled is based on calculations that involve how empty it is, how much the wage base has been the previous year, how much has been paid out the previous year. And because this was such an anomalous year in all ways, it would have sort of automatically gone to the most expensive fee schedule for businesses to pay unemployment insurance.
Right.
And so we have been sort of considering legislation to remedy that, and really wanted to make sure while we were remedying that and saving significant dollars for businesses, that beneficiaries, those receiving unemployment, were also seeing those improvements in the system and the acknowledgement of the challenges that we have had with the system and the beneficiaries over the last year. And so we have been debating various things, like increasing the reimbursement percentage. So it's only 57% that's reimbursed of people's wages. Increasing the maximum amount. So even if, sometimes you don't even get the 57 if your wages are high enough, because there's a maximum payout, but didn't want to do that because it's the lowest income Vermonters who are receiving unemployment that we most want to help. And it wouldn't help them because they're not at the maximum. We talked about a dependent care benefit, and that's actually what the Senate voted out, was just having an increased payment to folks who have dependents. A few other states do that. And so as we worked through all of those ideas, the Cobalt-based computer system, which is, like has a little flashing cursor, and we've heard about really so many stories about things that have gone wrong with it this year. The commissioner felt really clear that his office was not capable of making any of those changes. And to be frank, I lost a little bit of my patience because I understand that administrators and members of the administration often don't want to engage in something for policy reasons, and that's fine. But for me, I need them to be explicit about that rather than sort of hiding behind administrative concerns. Right. And so I said to the commissioner, we have a spaceship on Mars right now. And so I'm wondering what you would need in order to make this happen, not that you just can't make it happen because Mars, and this is just a computer system in the state of Vermont. So what we wound up with is, I think we are going to, one, be able to add a new supplemental benefit. So when the federal supplemental benefit of $300 goes away, we will be able to add a new Vermont-based supplemental benefit in order to increase everyone's benefits out into the future over the next 10-something years. And that's going to be worth about $100 million in benefits we're going to be paying out to Vermonters. And then we put in place this really awesome task force study to look at all of the problems with the unemployment insurance system, how fraud does happen, how fraud prevention keeps people from getting their benefits, how the system could be configured to better meet the needs of Vermonters that are on it, how the system could be better configured to meet the needs of employers. We're working with it, how it can actually meet a modern economy versus the economy that it was designed for in the 50s, all kinds of really awesome stuff, some really great government accountability built in. And I'm so excited for both the money we're going to be getting to Vermonters, for how we were able to fix the system so employers' rates weren't skyrocketing, and a task force. I love a good task force.
Yes. And when does this task force start its work?
As soon as we sign the little bill.
Yay. Okay. Oh, I hope we can revisit that again. I'd like to hear how that goes.
Totally.
Cool. Okay. Well, we need to hear from some of our underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro. So hang tight. The Montpelier Happy Hour will be back in a moment. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on iTunes, at our website, the Montpelier Happy Hour at captivate.fm, our Facebook page, as well as Emilie's social media as well. Oh, and BCTV, we can't forget BCTV, because I know that's where my mom watches us.
She does?
She does.
Hi, Olga's mom.
Emilie, you are a vice chair of the Ways and Means Committee. And one of the things you've been working on, of course, is tax policy. And the state is going through revising its tax policy, or it has the study committee. It's just released its report. But you mentioned the last time we talked about some federal changes that are happening. And what interests me about that is so often when you say the word taxes to people, it's something people usually have a very strong opinion about. And I know for my family, especially because many of us live in very rural communities, there's this sense that we pay a lot in property taxes, but they're not really seeing what their taxes are doing. And so it can be very frustrating because they feel like money's just kind of going out the door and they're not really seeing what happens with it. But you have some other thoughts on taxes and income inequality, and I would really love to hear more about that before we dive into what your committee's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I also want to say I have a pet theory, and it's very much like a totally imaginary pet theory that I'm probably never going to do anything about. But I think that if we had municipal garbage recycling compost pickup in the entire state of Vermont, people would feel very differently about taxes.
I actually think there's something to that.
I can't believe how lucky I am that a truck drives by once a week and picks up the waste from the end of my driveway. And I am blown away by how incredibly rare that is in the state of Vermont, including in Burlington. You have to contract it privately for parts of it. I mean, it's just wild. So anyway, roads, garbage, those are generally the things that people think of when they think of paying taxes. And here in Vermont, we have a lot of potholes and most of us don't have garbage pickup. And so it's hard to say, like, what are my taxes good for? Yeah. But one of the things, and they're good for lots of things. And, you know, we talk about how great administration can be and schools and stuff like that. But today we're talking about taxes and income inequality. And so there's a few pieces of that. So taxes structure our money in a lot of ways, and like how people invest and how people don't invest. And so one piece of that is really huge is where tax breaks happen. So, and what is credited with taxes? So there's a book that I'm really excited about that I can't get my phone to show up. I think it's called The Whiteness of Wealth. I'm not exactly sure. That talks about how tax structures have incentivized wealth development in white families and not in Black families over generations. And that's a big reason for the wealth gap. And so like certain family arrangements are incentivized in our tax structure. And I think we're all sort of fairly familiar with that idea. And we don't think of it as incentivizing family structures. We think of it as accommodating family structures, but those are generally the family structures that are the norm, that are accommodated, and those that are not are not. Right. So other aspects that are really important to think about are pieces like the earned income tax credit, or child and dependent care tax credits. So I know that for me, for, you know, most of my son's younger years, at the end of the year, I would get back, when I filed my taxes, I would get back this great big credit, and it would always be exactly as much as summer camp costs. And like the price of summer camp would change. And like summer camp is the weirdest thing to a working parent, because like it's not recreation. It's like you need somewhere for your kid to be during the day. It's childcare. But it's much like harder to navigate than childcare, which is already hard to navigate. We've talked about that a lot. And, you know, once your kid's public school age, they just go to school, and then you have to figure out summer in a different place. And anyway, it's very expensive. And so like, it was almost like government had sort of created a savings program for me that would sort of save up for summer camp, which was this really out of control expense in my cash flow for a long time. So and then there's other pieces of it that can really, tax structures can also really like incentivize the hoarding of wealth. So like the way capital gains are taxed or not taxed, the way wealth is taxed and not taxed, the way, you know, property might be taxed, but non-tangible wealth might not be taxed. And so there's systems that we put in place that sort of cause wealth to be hoarded more or less, essentially. And often we've talked about the problem of our state sort of welfare systems, using the phrase welfare very lightly, that, you know, they're complicated to navigate. You have to sign up for food stamps here, and dependent care benefits here, and health insurance here. And each of them have their own shame cycles attached to them, and their own barriers to jump through, and their own eligibility requirements. And we often ask the question, like, what would happen if we just gave people money instead?
Right.
And so what our tax structure can do in a lot of cases is just give people money instead. And at the federal level, that's much easier, because revenue on a federal level is not actually tied to how much the IRS collects. It's about how much money we make and how much money works within the Federal Reserve and stuff like that, which we're not going to get into right now. But it means that tax rebates don't necessarily cost the federal government money, and tax credits don't necessarily cost the federal government money in the same way they do on the state level, where we are not able to create currency.
Interesting. Okay.
Because we don't have a state bank, we have a federal.
Right.
So that's sort of the big framework for like taxes and wealth, and taxes and wealth equality and inequality. And then there's just like sort of the basics of like, we don't really tax the rich, and we tend to put more of our taxes on poorer people than richer people, because flat taxes are easier to administer than progressive taxes, sales tax versus income tax, for instance. There's all of that, but that's not what we're going to talk about as much today. Feel like I'm in a classroom, Olga.
You kind of are, because I think people are really clear about their frustrations with taxes, but that doesn't mean we actually understand how they work.
And I'm learning more and more every day. And I am so, I feel really blessed that the chair of my committee, who I really enjoy working with, was both a member of legislative council and then worked for the governor's administration many governors ago, and then was the commissioner of the Department of Taxes, and then left the administration to run for office, and now is what has been the chair of Ways and Means for a number of years. So I have a lot to learn about taxes from her, and I'm really delighted to do that every day. It's an incredible opportunity.
Remind us who the chair is.
Her name is Janet Ansell, and she will come on the show at some point in a couple of weeks when our legislative schedule opens up a little bit more.
Good.
So, another interesting thing about Vermont and taxes, some states link up their tax system and their tax choices to the federal system and federal choices. And that is, we talk about that as linking up or conformity, how much we conform to federal tax regulations and rules. Vermont does not have rolling conformity. So we don't automatically agree with the federal treatment of taxes every year, because federal treatment of taxes changes every year. We have to formally make a decision in statute whether we want to agree with federal tax law or not agree with federal tax law.
So you have to do this every time federal tax law changes?
We do.
Okay.
Yeah, that's called static conformity, meaning our conformity is set in the time that we last said, yes, we agree.
Okay.
So, Biden administration, new era in America. The money is flowing like water. Human rights are almost being respected in some places sometimes. Not everywhere, definitely not globally, maybe not at the border. We're doing like better on gay rights in schools, kind of. Anyway, new era. I should be more optimistic about this. Sorry, it's only been 100 days.
Exactly.
Okay.
There's still time to go.
There's a lot of time to go. But one of the things that Biden administration has been super focused on, even within this first 100 days, is child poverty. And in the American Rescue Plan Act, which is such an awkward thing to say, ARPA, but it's the American Rescue Plan Act. That's why we call it ARPA.
If I ever have a dog, I'm going to name it ARPA. It just sounds like a dog's name.
It does. I think you should get a dog and name it ARPA. I think that should be like your goal for the week.
I'm more of a cat person.
Maybe just this. Sometimes there are cats like dogs. Maybe if you got a cat and named it ARPA, it would act like a dog.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Do we have a plan?
We have a plan.
Next week, you're going to show all of our listeners your new pet named ARPA?
I can't. My landlord doesn't let me have pets.
It would be a lot to commit to, even if you could.
Yeah, but I think about it.
Maybe.
So, ARPA.
And perhaps one of our listeners wants to go find themselves a pet named ARPA and share it with us on social media.
Please do. We want pictures, definitely. Pictures of the new ARPA.
This idea. So, ARPA had a whole lot of changes in it. And a whole lot of money that came at the states But some very specific parts of it that are tax related explicitly are the earned income tax credit and the child and dependent care credit. So in Vermont law, the way we figure out the Vermont earned income tax credit is that it's 36% of the federal earned income tax credit, and that's fully refundable. So that means that the tax credit isn't just used to reduce your tax liability, but it's that money that you can get back at the end of the year if your tax liability is negative. That's what a refundable tax credit means.
Right.
So ARPA expanded the earned income tax credit for individuals without children. So for tax year 2021, which is the one we are living inside right now, the maximum credit for individuals without children increases from $543 to $1,402. That is almost a tripling.
Mm-hmm.
It repeals the maximum age limit, which was set at 65. It lowers the minimum age from 25 to 19. And it changes the maximum investment income threshold, which won't be as interesting to people. And people can use tax year 2019 instead of tax year 2020 to determine income for tax year 2021. So people can look at their income from pre-pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So what this means for Vermont is it really like significantly raises the opportunities for Vermonters without children to be getting an earned income tax credit that's much larger from the federal government. But if we link up, and that's something we're planning to do most likely this week, unless something goes drastically wrong, Vermont's 36% will also grow really significantly, because it would be 36% of $1,402, not 36% of $543. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it does.
Okay. And so we could see Vermonters' maximum earned income tax credit go up to like $2,000.
Whew.
Yeah.
Do we have any idea how many Vermonters might be eligible for that maximum tax credit?
Oh, you know what? I have a spreadsheet with that in it, but it would take me a very long pause to answer that question. What we do know is that it would cost about $6.19 million in fiscal year 2022 in order for us to even do that link up. So that's how much money would go out to Vermonters.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And Vermont's percentage of earned income tax credit that we link up with is one of the highest in the country.
Mm-hmm.
The only state I think that has a higher one than us is South Carolina, strangely. Yeah. At 62%, but everyone else is below our 36. So that's really interesting. The other one is, do you have questions about that, or shall I move on to our next text?
No, keep moving. I think that sounds interesting.
Okay. Great.
Yeah. I like the idea that more people getting money. And I have to say, as someone who doesn't have children, I often feel kind of passed over. And according to my grandmother, you know, since I am unmarried without children, she has questions about my validity as a human being. Anyways, but that's another story for another day.
Very valid human. And I think the decision to not have children is one of the most, I don't actually even understand why people have children. And I love my child very much, but it just makes everything more complicated.
Yes, it does.
And so that's one of the things I was talking about when I was talking about that book, The Whiteness of Wealth, like how our family structures are really incentivized or disincentivized by our tax structure, and how that helps some of us accumulate more wealth than others. And we already know about that if we think about gendered relationships. You know, a single woman makes a lot less money than a single man.
Right.
But we also know that a white male gay couple is going to have sort of the highest income of all. And so all kinds of interesting pieces of that. And that trickles down to tax policy and tax credits. And I find it really hard sometimes to look at this, you know, to do this work in a way that I just don't want to start giggling about with excitement about all of, you know, the extra tax benefits I'm going to get. So that's an awkward way to do that.
I suspect most people don't consider giggling when they're reading through tax policy.
I mean, they do if they find out like $5,000 is going to arrive in the mail from, you know, President Biden. Giggle at that, right?
That's a giggly moment, yes.
So the other big one is the child and dependent care credit. And so Vermont's child and dependent care credit is sort of complicated. So Vermont's child and dependent care credit that's non-refundable is 24% of the federal child and dependent care credit. So it's a similar structure to the earned income tax credit. But we also have a refundable one that's specifically for lower income folks. And that's set at 50%. And I'll get a little bit into that more. So, and this is a real significant expansion. So at the federal level, it's entirely refundable for tax year 21. And it's a $4,000 maximum credit per qualifying individual and $8,000 for 2 or more individuals. Right now, without these changes, the credit is $2,100 for 2 or more individuals. So that's a huge expansion from $2,000 up to $8,000. It's calculated by taking 50% of qualifying expenses, whereas right now it's between 20 and 35. It's either 20%, between 20% and 35%. And the maximum expenses that can be taken into account are increased from $3,000 for a child to $8,000 for a child, and from $6,000 for 2 or more children to $16,000 for 2 or more children. So what you're actually able to sort of count as an exemption has also significantly gone up. It also significantly increased the income limits. So current law, the credit percentage is phased out by 1% for every $2,000 above $15,000, which means that like it drops out somewhere in like your 45, 50 range. But the new federal law is that it's 1% for every $2,000 above $125,000.
Oh, for an individual or a couple?
The full benefits, the full credits up to an income level of $125,000 a year. Yeah.
Wow.
Because a family making $125,000 a year with 2 kids is likely spending like $50,000 of that on childcare. I mean, it's a real acknowledgement of what the cost of care looks like in a household with more than 1 kid. So that is also a really exciting link up change. Because most of the changes to the child and dependent care credit are at the higher limits being sort of included rather than more money necessarily going to lower income folks. And our tax credit is not refundable. In Vermont, the link up will have less of an impact than the earned income tax credit link up. But it will still have a pretty significant impact, and that is really exciting. One of the interesting things as we've been working through, the earned income tax credit has sort of like very clear impacts, right? Like they're in front of you. When we work through the child and dependent care credit impacts, it's interesting in Vermont because if a family is receiving childcare subsidy, they're likely not paying very much in childcare costs. And so they're not as eligible for this credit for the costs that they paid. And that's more likely to happen at the lower income end because they'd be more likely to be eligible for the childcare credits. but that's the only time that it's refundable. So
there's a little bit of give and take there.
There's a little bit of give and take there. And I'm sort of looking at some math with Joint Fiscal Office to see, like, are there tweaks we can make to make sure we're really like getting into that benefit trough that we've talked about a few times? Right. So there's a population of folks with kids in like the 35,000 to the 50,000 a year range ish, who really have this very challenging financial time because of the costs of things and the tax scale of things and what benefits are available and what aren't, where income is experienced as flat even when it's going up almost $15,000 a year. And so wondering if the child dependent care credit is a way of sort of tweaking that, as a way of helping with some of that. So those are both some really exciting federal changes that are going to have a big impact on Vermonters' lives.
Yes. And, you know, I have to say, Emilie, not only was that an impressive explanation, but you did it with 5 minutes to spare for the show. Woohoo!
Thanks. A lot of listeners calling in and saying, like, this is the funnest show you all have ever had.
They'd be crazy not to.
They would be crazy not to. I mean, I've talked practically the whole time. We didn't have any guests on. We're basically just talking about numbers that no one can see in front of them, so they're really hard to process. I think this was a screaming success of a show today.
It was. It is. And I think we need to toast to how fully this show reflects our goal of going deep geek. Absolutely. And just be really nerdy.
Thank you. And if any listeners have made it this far through me just spouting percentages, and you actually want to see any of these numbers in front of you, please feel free to comment on social media or send an email, and I will send some charts your way.
Well, because we talk a lot about income and whether people can actually afford to live and work in Vermont, which is really important for you and I, because we love this state. And as in the weeds as this conversation may have been, it really is crucial to how much people take home at the end of a tax year. And the more you can take home, the more you can put towards your family, which in the long run goes back to the community.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we've seen so much this year is that the more money Vermonters have in their pockets, because of so much of these federal benefits, the more that circulates through our economy and it winds up in state coffers so that we can provide more centralized benefits to Vermonters. And so there's really like a glorious virtuous cycle about this kind of federal spending. Yeah,
what you talked about today with some of the increases with like the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, it feels to me like one nice thing this pandemic did is it made a lot of people really, truly realize the cost of things.
Yes.
And how so many of our, what are supposed to be support systems really need to catch up to how people are actually living right now.
Yeah. Yep. And we're going to work on that and get it done.
Well, on that note, I would like to toast to understanding the cost of things and understanding what it takes for a community to thrive, and to you and your committee for diving into these very weedy, very dense tax policies and making things better for the rest of us.
To you, Olga, and to the fact of a public announcement that the tax filing deadline is Monday.
Yes.
And people should file their taxes, because there's also an extra sort of there's also a child benefit that the feds are paying out directly that you're eligible for up until when you file on Monday. So don't be late with your taxes. Okay. I haven't done mine yet, but I have a really exciting weekend planned. So cheers. I handed mine in and I was told I was being an adult. I almost cried. Cheers to adulting.
Thank you for joining us on the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can find us on iTunes as well as our Facebook page. And Emilie, remind us where folks can find you.
Folks can start on emiliekornheiser.org. You can probably spell that a wide variety of ways, and you would still find your way to my website, emiliekornheiser.org, where you can find links to my Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, email address, phone number, as well as a link to join my weekly Sunday community conversations via Zoom.
Thank you. Have a great weekend, everybody.